Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. I hope you are well. Most of you out there understand that whenever you're making an economic decision or a decision in life, for that matter, we have to do a proper cost benefit analysis. As Dr. Thomas Sowell teaches us, there are no solutions, there are only trade offs. And this goes back to him referencing a cost benefit analysis. Now, with these lockdowns that we've seen in 2020 and 2021, most of the people in society, most of the average Joe and Janes, and especially the politicians and the people that are ahead or the heads of these institutions, they only focus on the perceived benefits of lockdowns. So they get hyper focused on we have to save lives. Australia would be a fantastic example of this right now. We have to save one life at any cost. There is no cost great enough. If we have to turn our entire country, or at least New South Wales, the East Coast, into a totalitarian police state, well, then that's what we have to do if it means saving one life of someone who is 82 years old. This is the approach they're taking. They completely ignore the costs. Now, I want to show you a research paper that is incredibly extensive. And I'm going to go ahead and put the link in the description below once we get done with the live stream, because I'd encourage each and every one of you to read this article when you get a spare 20 minutes, half hour. It's actually incredibly extensive. But if there was any doubt in your mind that these lockdowns don't make sense when you do a cost benefit analysis, those doubts will be completely extinguished. They will be eradicated as soon as you read this very, very thorough research paper. So let's dive into it right now and then kind of look at what their rationale is, but then also kind of think about could they have gone farther? I think they could have, because what they do is they just look at the cost benefits of today and on society, but they don't really go into the costs of giving the government that much power and control over our daily lives and what that has led to in the past when you study history. Let's dive into the article. I think you guys will really enjoy it. And this is on a website called T and F, or it's probably Tand F online or something like that. But regardless, we'll put a link in the description below. So the article title is Cerveza Sickness Lockdown Cost Benefits, a critical assessment of the literature. And this was published by a gentleman by the name of Douglas W. Allen. And I believe my research assistant, Josh, came across this on Jordan Peterson's Twitter feed. So, first off, an examination of over 100 cerveza sickness studies reveals that many relied on false assumptions that overestimated the benefits and underestimated the costs of lockdown. Most of you are probably saying, well, duh, I already knew that. But it gets interesting when they dive into the details. And they conclude the summary by stating, and I'll highlight this, it is possible that lockdowns will go down as one of the greatest peacetime failures, greatest peacetime policy failures in modern history. So I'm going to be scrolling through a good portion of this study because it is very extensive. Over the course of the cerveza sickness, there has been no public evidence that governments around the world have considered both the benefit and the costs side of their policy decisions. I have been literally saying this till I'm blue in the face. I've been saying this for months now, probably over a year. I've been saying this. I've been pounding the table saying governments are only looking at the benefits. They're not looking at the costs. And not just governments, but the mainstream media, the institutions, and most of your friend and family member Freds. I'm sure you guys watching the video right now and watching it in the future will be nodding your head saying, yes, I get it. Almost every single person around me or on Facebook falls into this category where they're only looking at benefits and totally ignoring costs. And then he goes on to say, to my knowledge, no government has provided formal cost benefit analysis of their actions. So what's really, and I encourage going through this whole thing, but for the sake of time, I want to focus on, everyone knows the benefits. We hear that in the media and by the central planners nonstop. But and I think a lot of you know the costs, but let's go over those specifically because that's what we hear or what we don't hear in the mainstream media. And as you can see, as I'm scrolling down, this is a very thorough research paper. So 2.4, the costs of lockdowns. First, lockdown costs depend on the expectations people have on how long they will last. So even if the government would have done a cost benefit analysis, let's say in March of 2020, well, they only would have measured the costs for 2 weeks. Because remember, it's just 2 weeks to flatten the curve. But then what happens is it turns into 2 months. It turns into 4 months. It turns into 6 months. It turns into a year. It turns into a year and a half. And I know in the United States, we haven't had lockdowns that long, but look at Australia, many countries have. And in the United States, although we haven't implemented more lockdowns, we have become far more draconian in other ways, such as the medicine mandates. So great point here that initially, even if they did a cost benefit analysis, they're only doing it for a short time frame and they weren't doing it for, let's say, a year, and they weren't doing a cost benefit analysis on all the other government restrictions that we have seen in the United States. I'd also add that they're not doing a cost on what if we have future lockdowns. I mean, look at Australia. They have been in a perpetual state of lockdown, at least the East Coast, for, I mean, almost 2 years now, or at least a year for that matter. And so this is something that, especially in Australia, I think they need to do the costs on not only what it has cost society there over the past, let's say, year, but what it will cost society when they continue, or if they continue these lockdowns, which I think they most likely will, into the indefinite future. How long will they last? Will they last 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? And for those of you who may say, oh, George, well, that's completely ridiculous. Is it? Because think about their rationale for doing the lockdowns right now, that they have to prevent even one COVID death is too much. Therefore, they have to prevent that at all costs. Okay, well, how is that going to change in 2 years? See, what we're dealing with the cerveza sickness is you're dealing with something that you cannot eradicate, at least not with the tools that we have right now. Why? Because those tools don't offer something called sterilizing immunity. And so for any of your friend and family member Freds who talk about other types of medicines for other things that we have seen in the past, I try to keep it YouTube friendly. What they don't understand are those medicines offered sterilizing immunity. The medicines we have right now do not. Therefore, if they don't get what is called an R naught value down under 1, which they don't with the most recent, we'll call them variant of the cerveza sickness, then you can't eradicate it. It's endemic. It's here. You're just going to have to deal with it. So if their rationale, again, for the lockdowns today is because they have to eliminate even one cerveza sickness death, regardless of what the cost is, therefore locking people in their house and not allowing them outside for or more than an hour a day, shutting down playgrounds, doing whatever else they're doing, basically turning the country into a totalitarian police state. Well, then how will that not be applicable in 2 years, in 10 years? Because in 10 years, if the tools that they have at their disposal stay consistent with what they are now, the Australian public will be dealing with the cerveza sickness in 10 years in a similar fashion to the way they're dealing with it today. So if they can justify lockdowns today, why can't they justify lockdowns for the next 10 years? You see, that's really the logical conclusion to where this leads. If you take it to its logical conclusion, that's where you end up with a lockdown, a totalitarian police state forever, for the rest of their lives in Australia. Let's keep moving on. These expectations have constantly changed. The lockdowns have repeatedly extended, initially 2 weeks, 16 months. Second, many costs will manifest over time, and the estimates of the costs cannot be done yet. Right. So, how do you determine the cost of locking? Like, let's just talk about the psychological cost of locking 3-year-olds in a house for 16 months. You think that's not going to have an effect on them? I mean, how do you determine the cost of a 2-year-old going through an entire year of their developmental phase where they don't see a face of an adult outside of their home because every single face is covered up with a mask? Do you really think that's not going to have any psychological impact on a kid long term? I mean, again, I'm no psychologist, but if you listen to the psychologists, they actually say that there is absolutely no way that that won't negatively impact the kids in this society. Now, once they get to about maybe 7 or 8 years old, fine. Now they can really handle it. But when the kids, when their brain is developing from, let's call it a year, even 6 months probably, to 2 or 3 years, that's a critical time. And when you're putting them in this psychotic, upside down Alfred Hitchcock world, where everyone is wearing a mask. You can't see people's face. You can't see their expressions. You can't hear them talk. And also, the kids most likely aren't even allowed outside for most of the day. Again, huge impact on them long term, negative impact psychologically. So, how do you measure that? Because that's something that we won't see for decades to come. I mean, even talking about the financial implications of reduced GDP. I mean, we hear about Australia and how that, oh, well, their GDP hasn't gone down that much, or in Canada, or their GDP hasn't gone down that much here in the United States. Right. But look at what the debt's done. So that would be assuming that the debt just doesn't matter, when in reality, society is going to have to pay for that. They're going to have to pay for it now through inflation, or the kids and grandkids are going to have to pay for it through higher rates of inflation or just higher rates of taxation. So third, without the lockdowns, there would have been a negative consequence from the cerveza sickness. And these must be separated from the costs of the lockdown reaction. Nailed it. And this is, I mean, again, something I've been pounding the table on for months now, if not over a year, where I say, and you guys have heard me say this many times, where I'll stop what I'm reading and I'll say, whoa, time out. This is not because of the cerveza sickness. This is a result of the government's response to the cerveza sickness. Those are two completely separate things, and we must compartmentalize them. And that's, I think, what he's doing here. Fourth, lockdowns take place in the context of other countries, and there are general equilibrium and feedback effects that require sorting out, such as look at the semi chip conductors that go into the manufacture of all these cars for GM. Well, they can't produce any cars. Therefore, they can't sell any. Therefore, the price of a new car goes from, call it $35,000 up to $47,000. Well, who pays that? Well, that would be the consumer who's out there buying a car. So, because of these lockdowns, you, the consumer, the American consumer, the lockdowns globally are paying much, much higher prices for the stuff that you buy daily. And regardless of how many stimmy checks you got, your purchasing power has gone down, not up. And by definition, that makes us poorer. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about future generations. When considering losses of GDP, it's important to note that these losses have not been evenly distributed. Canada, like most countries, borrowed to finance lockdown transfer payments, which transfers the debt burden to younger generations. And that's assuming they don't just hyperinflate the debt away with this generation or in this generation. But this also points out the fact that we are doing everything we can to save the lives of individuals, but we're not defining or even considering who these individuals are. And going back to Australia, using that as an example, the average age of someone who has passed away from the cerveza sickness in Australia is 82 years old. 82. So it is true. I mean, I don't want anyone to die. I don't care if they're young, old, middle aged, it doesn't matter. But we have to consider that when we're doing a proper cost benefit analysis, right? So let's just say that those people had an additional 5 years of life on average, giving them the benefit of the doubt that they would have lived to 87. Okay, well, what you're doing is you're saving those people's lives at the expense of all the young people. Is that really a prudent move? And also, I'd point out that you're giving them 5 years in the case of Australia, but they're in lockdown. So are they really living? And I always say this on Twitter, is just because you are alive doesn't mean you are living. And that's something they just don't understand, these governments. Well, maybe they understand, but they don't care because their end game, obviously, is just power control and micromanaging your daily life. And this is another reason why I have suggested that whenever you're thinking about the deaths from the cerveza sickness, don't think it in those terms. Don't think about the lives lost. Think about the years lost. And when you calculate the years lost in a lockdown, because let's use Australia as an example again, 25 million people. Let's say they lock down for a year, which affects half the population. So that would be 12.5 million years lost because all those people lost a year of their life being locked up in jail, especially the young kids, the children. And then, so what did we save? Well, let's say they've had 1,000 deaths. Let's say they would have had 50,000. We'll do the math and just calculate, just give each one of those deaths an additional 5 years because on average they're 82 years old. And then what you find is that even if the Australian government would have pursued the same policies as a Florida, well, then they would have had 50,000 deaths. That would have equated to about 250,000 years lost. But by doing the lockdowns, they lost 12.5 million years. So they're trading 12.5 million years of young people, by the way, for 250,000 years of old people. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And this is exactly what they're saying in this study. They give further examples of the costs. For example, Miles finds that costs exceed benefits for every one of their 40 scenarios, even though they use the overestimated Ferguson counterfactual of lives saved. In other words, despite underestimating the costs and overestimating the benefits, they still concluded, we find that the costs of 3-month lockdown in the UK are likely to have been high relative to the benefits, so that a continuation of severe restrictions is unlikely to be warranted. Right. But see what they're doing, because they're scientists and economists, is they're focusing on they're assuming the incentives of the politicians are to do what's right for society. You see, what they're not including in their analysis is that the politicians, most of them, have no concern whatsoever for what's right or what's the best for society. Their only concern is gaining more power and more control. So when you look at through that lens, I think the costs to giving the government this type of power and control to by allowing them to take your freedom and liberty, there would be far more costs than have even been concluded or have been included in this article, where the conclusion is that the cost benefit analysis doesn't make sense at all. Okay, for the sake of time, we're going to end it there. I think you guys get it. You can see this is a fantastic article. I cannot suggest suggest enough reading it, so we'll put a link in the description below. I think what we'll do on the next live streams for the day is a super chat. I don't know if we've got that set up. I know what I usually do at these live streams is I go back and forth, kind of looking at the camera and then going down, looking at my computer and trying to go over the article and what I've highlighted in advance. But I wish I could read some of the comments in real time, but I can't do that when I'm actually looking at the article. And I'd like to answer some of your questions. So for the next live stream, what we'll do, and we'll try it out, see how it works, is if you guys want to do a super chat, I think all of those collect in the top there. So when I get done doing the analysis or whatever we're talking about on the live stream, I'll just look at the super chats and see if I can either comment, or if they're a question, just answer them briefly. So look forward to that. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and I will see you on the next video.